Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. All the time zones welcome. This is a very inclusive time zone space. This is where time stops and continues all at the same time. Um, Welcome to all of you who've never been to this space called Tertuliando en Cuarentena, which I guess translates to a form of gathering in quarantine in these times of pandemia, in these times of um, COVID 19. Now in this 2020, coming to the last end of this 2020 interesting year, for lack of other expressions that I could very well express as. So this space is basically a space of a safe space of having of encountering each other, intersectionality, and talking about where we are in our lives, what how have we gotten to where we're at. And I really have valued, and I really have appreciated all the time that I've been able to do this now for over 8 months, Monday through Friday. And it's been a lot of different folks of different types of pilgrimages. So it is an enriching experience, and I consider myself super lucky to have had the chance to do this. And I consider myself super lucky to have today's guests all the way from down under, hence my intro on the expansiveness of the different time zones. So good morning to my Australian friends. So today, we have a person I met some time ago cybernetically, but this is the first time we're actually meeting in pixels and video form. So any further ado, let me bring my friend Eddie Synot. Um, Hopefully, I'm pronouncing your last name right. Is it Synot, Synot, or
No, you got it right the first time,
Synot?
which is very rare. Most people struggle with it,
I
so
want to go the
it's
other
good.
way, right? I want to do the, but I went the Spanish way.
There you go. It's apparently of French Irish origins, so um, not that I, but yeah, I most people either drop the Y and just call me Snot or Snotty as a that's a childhood thing that still haunts me, or they think the T is silent or something like that. So yeah,
Conveniently, the Y dropping it and making
yeah,
maybe it's a I don't know what my experience in Australia is, that my fellow friends in Australia have a terrific sense of humor. So
mm,
I'm sure that might come naturally to some. But this is our first get together. Not there yet. Maybe in our second meeting I can drop the Y. Um, Not my aspirations, pero gracias, man. Thanks so much for being here and joining us in this space of talking, conversation, of dialogue, of tertulias, as we say in Spanish. Really
yeah.
appreciate it,
No,
man.
thank you, and it's really cool hearing the introduction as well about especially feeling privileged to be able to host this space, and it's a great privilege. I've done a couple of things like this. And earlier in the year too, especially on kind of Black Lives Matter in Australia,
Mm.
but in the Pacific. So I did a couple of events with some colleagues in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea online, and so it's fantastic. Whilst we've kind of been locked up inside or kind of being cut off from each other, we've been able to find other ways to connect. I think more than perhaps previously we have as well. So it's fantastic.
Yeah, no, I consider it such because it's not every day you can get to do this. Well, I mean, for me, it has almost been every day because I've been doing it from Monday to Friday. But even then, even though I can completely take it for granted as it's almost a given. But it really is not a given, because I'm not doing this by myself. I'm doing this with every single person that agrees to talk,
Yeah.
to be vulnerable in this space. And I really have to acknowledge that that is never that is to never be taken as a given. That is
Mm.
a super privilege to have. So You're here, and I feel privileged to be able to talk to you in this sense, and also just how technology brings us
Yeah,
from opposite ends. It is magnificent. It is magnificent.
yeah, yeah.
And I like to talk, talking about the pandemic, the current context that we're in, and I would like to, get a feel of, what were you doing, beginning of 2020. I know it was heavy transition from 19 to 20 for Australia. But get your feel of it. What were you doing, pre-COVID, professionally, personally, what were you navigating
Yeah.
into? And then this is a bit of a three-layered question. I like to begin things starting a bit off of like fast pace, but it'll slow down as we progress.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
just the
cool.
only three-layered question. So what were you doing pre-COVID? What were you finding yourself doing in the beginning of 2020? Then COVID comes. Then COVID hits. Around February, March, maybe a little bit later in Australia. But what did that do? How did that affect that which you were doing? And kind of would love to get a rundown of how that's been for these last 8 months. And then the last part of this question is, would like to get a perspective of what your readings are in terms of humanity, in terms of society with pandemia. What has
Mm.
this pandemia has brought out in people that you have noticed? What has it brought out in you? Because this is very unique time. So it's, I think, observable to notice how we have responded to this and what has come out of us in this circumstance. So what were you doing before pandemia comes? How has it been? 8 9 months, and then your observations in terms of society and pandemia.
Yeah. I guess a big thing that a lot of people around the world would probably be aware of too is that we were smack bang in the middle of a bushfire season in Australia. So massive parts of the east coast of Australia and other parts of Australia were on fire. Um, and when we talk about climate change and global warming and the political kind of issues around that, which we're not immune to here. So that was a massive kind of shadow over everyone. We were kind of isolated where I was in Brisbane, where I am now too, from that. But it had a big impact on the nation, family, in those areas and stuff like that too. Personally, my wife and I, we had a miscarriage at the end of 2019, and I just accepted a new job in Sydney as the centre manager of the Indigenous Law Centre as well. So it was a big. We had a fair bit, fair bit going on before COVID kind of hit, and what we were doing, and I am involved through my research and work in something called the Uluru Dialogue. So I'm an Aboriginal Australian person myself, Wamba Wamba First Nations. That's the Aboriginal flag just above my head there in Australia. And so I'd been traveling around a bit with that group, and it's a group that focuses on constitutional reform to Australia's constitution for self-determination and empowerment for Indigenous people. So we'd been pretty active and doing a lot of work in that. And that was part of the job that I took up in Sydney as well. So the Indigenous Law Centre at the University of New South Wales is a key partner of the Uluru Dialogue group that's been doing this work. So I went down there. I'd been kind of flying back once a fortnight when we could afford it. To if anyone's not aware, Sydney, Australia is like in the top 3 or 4 most expensive places to live in the world. I
Yep.
also hate it. It's a disgusting place, but that's just me personally. um, so all of that was happening. I was in a bit of a weird place personally and professionally as well. Like we had the miscarriage, and we were dealing with that. But professionally, I been doing my PhD for forever, like 7 or 8 years. Part time, also been working, and I was on kind of like short term contracts at the university I was working at, and it was all up in the air about kind of what was happening and stuff like that. And Professor Megan Davis, who's a mentor of mine and was my boss at UNSW. She's on the United Nations Permanent Forum for Indigenous People. She's a, just a massively outstanding community person, scholar, leader in our country. And I've been working with her through the constitutional reform stuff and Uluru Dialogue, and the opportunity come up to go to Sydney. So we went to Sydney. We're doing that. We're kind of coming out, and after the miscarriage, and my wife fell pregnant again, and we were making the plans to move to Sydney permanently. And I'd been kind of in Sydney, getting used to that, and then COVID hit. And I think one of our, professionally and personally, one of our big focuses was its impact on Indigenous communities, especially our rural and remote communities. So, a lot of our people in this country have a lot of respiratory issues, and, our health services and the services that we do have in communities are strained, as they exist already without a kind of pandemic coming on. And one of the interesting things we saw here in Australia it was our Indigenous communities that kind of led the actions or the charge or the response to COVID before the kind of national governments or our state and local governments did. So they, very aware of the risk that it posed, or how to manage community life, but also following that, so our communities and our peak organisations, like our Aboriginal health organisations that kind of owned and controlled and run by our communities themselves, were kind of they're on the front foot, and they got organised before government did, and kind of dragged government kicking and screaming that we have to manage this and do something about it. But then we also saw the response of government inordinately affecting Indigenous people in Australia too. So, we're already, and our communities are already over-policed and over-criminalised and stuff like that too. So we'd see pictures of, people breaching lockdown laws in Sydney, rich white men taking their kids to these places where they're not supposed to go, and they just get told to go home kind of thing. And we'd see other instances of, Indigenous people in the community being locked up overnight by the police, or being, fined and being taken to, being incarcerated basically for the same kind of thing. So we were, kind of mixed bag of being in the moment and trying to have to deal with what, for a lot of our people too, in some communities, like our elders, some of our languages, they're the last people that speak some of our languages across the country. So the risk of, losing a generation of people that already have poor health because of our socioeconomic status and because of the history of colonialism and the impact and stuff like that, is very big. And then we've got this, added thing on the top, which is the never-ending kind of issues in dealing with police and criminalisation and the way that was being applied to our communities. And then also a lot of those communities were still dealing with or coming through what had happened with the bushfires, where a lot of their communities had been decimated too. So that's kind of, how that happened. And then we all got sent home to work. So in a fortunate way, I guess I was able to, I left Sydney at that time and returned to Queensland, where I am now, before they closed our internal borders. So a lot of our states, they closed the internal borders between them to try and, as part of the pandemic response. So I was lucky enough to get back over the border before that happened, and have been working from home. And we've had a pretty good kind of support package nationally from our government that's been able to help, but it's still not enough, and they're starting to take, get rid of that now and move forward. And there's been, I guess, the third part of your question about the humanity. It's very hard to ignore the political debate in our country about the pandemic and the kind of fissures or the tensions that's kind of highlighted in our politics and in our society or community, more broadly. And I think they'd be similar to the kind of stuff that we see and hear about some of the American debates in the US about, the responses to it, and But from an Aboriginal perspective as well, there's been this kind of gross argument in Australia that most of the people that are dying from COVID are elderly anyway, so we're probably only extending their life by so many years. And for an Aboriginal community, our elders are everything. Our
Yeah.
tradition, our cultures, everything is held by them, and it really highlighted this other kind of chasm between attitudes toward community and not there's a very particular kind of news outlets and conservative commentators making those arguments too. It's definitely not something that I think is a mainstream view in Australia, but it's one that's troubling nonetheless. When we come down to this fundamental, are we a society or are we an economy? And even our former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, if anyone's familiar with him, he's been over in Europe now, and he was making the same comments about the elderly, and we really need to think about what resources we're wasting on them by saving their lives and stuff like that. So I think there's that part to it, which a lot of people would be familiar with, I guess, around the world, and the political arguments about it. But I think overall, I am a bit of a pessimist when it comes to humanity and how people treat one another and everything else. But I think generally as a community, we've shown our better nature in Australia. We've had all the kind of ridiculous things about toilet paper running out of the shopping centres, and people rushing to buy up on everything. But there has been, I think, an ability to be able to achieve some quite, ordinary things in difficult times. It's just we're always kind of dealing with that unfortunate and quite naive and ignorant political arguments as well about some of these things, which I think everyone, like I said, is probably familiar with. Kind of mirrored, dare I say, Trumpism type stuff as well, but yeah, that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, it's there are a number of parallels in happening all over the world at almost exactly the same times. But now in times of COVID, it even happens at a more apparent like parallelity or parallelness, given that the whole world is going through the same circumstance, and it's an observable measure, at least here, as I am here. I'm from Puerto Rico, but as I am here in the United States right now, it's an observable thing that statistically speaking, the people who are affected most, who are most vulnerable, are BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous, Brown, people of color here in the U.S. So there's a disparaging number that isn't very surprising, but
yeah, we even had there was a mini report kind of come out about New South Wales policing, and so they've most of the states and territories in Australia have introduced emergency powers because of the pandemic. So there's special fines they can give out, and they can arrest people and they can search people, whereas previously they wouldn't have been able to. And the percentage of fines that was given out, or where these things were happening, was much higher in the lower socioeconomic suburbs of Sydney and those other areas. And the same thing, it's not because these areas are inherently more criminal than other areas. It's because the police over police these areas, and the attitude. So it, like I said, in one way, it's there's that common humanity kind of thing, and there has been some extraordinary things that have been achieved, but at the same time, it's really highlighted those existing issues and tensions. So one big issue is food security in remote Indigenous communities, and it's something that I've been researching for a long time. I work with people that have been in that space for 3-4 decades that have been arguing. So the cost of food and goods in these remote communities can be sometimes as 1,000% more markup than what it is in the city centres.
Yeah.
And the national government has instigated an inquiry as a response to COVID and the pandemic into food security. But it's an issue that's been around since the beginning, that of these communities, and that the government has had an active hand in creating themselves. So they kind of bite my tongue on the pessimism and hope that something good comes out of the inquiry, but at the same time, it's they're doing it now, and they do a little flashy video for themselves on TV, say this is part of their developed pandemic response, from a government point of view, when we know these communities have been suffering for 3 or 4 decades. And we saw it again yesterday. The New South Wales state government, so we're talking about the COVID pandemic, but the bushfires for us are, communities are still kind of responding to that. And the New South Wales government just cut the fire service by 20%, their budget. So it's phenomenal to think that, after coming through that, the worst bushfire season we've ever had, and how that plays out. So these political arguments about, so they've given out $100 vouchers for people to go and buy food and to go out to dinner to try and stimulate the economy following the end of the lockdown in New South Wales. But at the same time, they've cut 20% from the rural fire service. So there's just some mind-boggling decisions, and a lot of it does come down to that quite the ideological kind of stuff that's been going on, but like the very strict kind of boundaries and the differences in the political and the ideological stuff, and the Trumpism, and where we follow, I think, behind America, like a lot of other places. Australia's always had this weird, predominantly Anglo country in the middle of the Asia Pacific, so it's always had an issue with itself and its identity and racism and where it fits. And once we kind of turned away from the British in a way, we looked to America, and we haven't looked back, and we've got this complicated identity relationship in between the two. And so as soon as the Trump kind of stuff came up, but even before Trump too, the creeping kind of hard right conservatism, the bigotry and stuff like that, and that's infiltrated our politics and stuff too. So as soon as Trump started going on about hydrochloroquine and UV lights and stuff like that for treating COVID, we had a couple of our politicians and
replicate
in our national, replicating and trying to get these studies done and stuff like that. And our chief medical officer, I guess in a similar role to Fucci or whatever his name is over there in the US, saying that it's ridiculous, and no medical, no science, no nothing like that. But these people have a mouthpiece, and conservative news outlets and stuff like that. So it's been such a big part of the response. So people have been towing the line, people have been listening to, and respectful of it all. And I think the Australian people, on a whole, understand the challenge that we face and the advice and everything else. It's just that we have these elements in our political class, I guess.
And I think it's a world. I mean, it's clearly a world phenomenon. And living in the globalized state that we live now, and with the undeniable influence that the U.S. has over the world, well, you can't just delete these last 4 years. These last 4 years have definitely caused an impact, and even as we are entering a quote unquote post-Trump era, what is that going to look like? Because it might be a post-Donald Trump era, but a post-Trumpian era, I don't think that's, or a post-Trumpist era. I don't think we're there, we're anywhere there yet. Or it's like, when we're talking about post-colonial issues, like post-colonial for who? I live in a country that's still a colony of the United States of America. So it's like, to ask American Samoa, ask Guam, how do they feel about post-colonialism or post-colonial approaches when it's happening right out as you walk into your back door and you see how the disparaging and how second, third class citizenship it is what you actually have coming from the empire. So it definitely is a contagious, and a popular trend to have a mouthpiece hurling out these things, and then have a fertile ground that is waiting, like the dog whistle waiting to
Yeah.
respond to that, and that's everywhere. I'm sure that's everywhere. You know, so something I also like to do here, and it gives you an opportunity to get to know you more, and also people watching get to know a little bit more about your trajectory. You know, how you are and how you got into where you're at. Is done this way, where if you can to share three 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 moments or three experiences or three, it could be incidents, it could be seasons, it could be episodes, but three things that you refer to throughout your life that you reckon were things of transformative outcome of serious reflection, things that you allude to looking back in the rear view mirror of life, that you see, oh yeah, this led to this led to that, and I'm sure my life would be somewhat significantly different if I had not gone through these experiences. So if you could share at least three, no more,
Yeah.
but that you can iconically remember that you feel have a lot to do with where you find yourself right now.
I think number one is just my family in general. So growing up, I grew up in a single parent family with a single mum. My parents were divorced. We went and lived with my mum's family in New South Wales, so which is my Aboriginal family. So we grew up quite poor. We lived in social housing. Went to public schools until later on, and I think a lot of those experiences growing up, just observing things around me, always kind of had a sense there was a lot of dysfunction, a lot of harm. Um, but my family, and I love them regardless. And growing up in those areas, and it's such a formative, people in Australia too. There's this kind of pernicious debate about Aboriginal identity. So because of my fair skin, people assume that I discovered that I was Aboriginal at a later date, or it's something I choose to identify with. And for me, I just am Aboriginal. I was born that way. I grew up that way. I was fortunate enough to grow up on the land and on the country that my ancestors have been on for thousands of generations, regardless of whether we have the history here in Australia through colonialism, and then through frontier wars and genocide, partial genocide, and being put into missions and camps and stuff like that. But for, I don't know, as an accident of history or whatever it was, my family in that area, have still been able to stay on that land ever since. And that's been a very big, and it's something I come back to all the time. So it's so important to me. But I always knew or felt, I didn't know what I wanted to do, or what it was that I was going to do, but I wanted to do something. So whether it was something is kind of, which now I think is a bit ridiculous, a bit materialist when I look back about it. But if I went to a friend's house from school or something and they had nice things, and I was like, Mum, why can't we have that? Or why do they have those nice
Yeah.
things? But even things, I think one moment out of that kind of history of growing up, my uncle, who's now passed, he said to me one day, you can go to university one day if you want. And it's just stuck with me so clearly, that conversation. I can remember what he was wearing, what we were doing, where we were, kind of in the front yard of his house. And he told me not to become a lawyer though, because lawyers are high-paid prostitutes. So I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer now. So yeah. So there's that. That's and that's just. I think if you speak to any kind of Indigenous person as well, family's going to be and upbringing. It's just so much part of who I am today. My my research, how I go about it. The second part, or second moment I can think of, was education, and a teacher in particular. I didn't have the best time. I was an angry, emotional teenager that was self-destructive, and would find ways to harm myself emotionally and physically, and
Hmm.
didn't have the best ways of dealing with things. And a couple of good teachers, but one in particular, she was a white South African woman who had left South Africa, and kind of left her family because of her experiences of their racism and wanting to do something else. And I don't know, she just she she was life changing. She took an interest. She encouraged me. She provided financially for me when with the things that I couldn't do or that I needed. And I think she was the key difference when, although my uncle had said to me years before that university and these kind of things were an option, even when I was at school and with everything else that was going on, I never believed it or felt that I belonged at university or there was something that I could do. And she was someone that really encouraged me and went out of her way, drove to where I was living at the time because I was couch surfing or living at different people's houses and stuff like that. And would take me to the university experience days and stuff like that. So she was someone, she's sadly passed of breast cancer. And that was something, she was an amazing person that, the love of some people to someone that, I'm not her son, I'm not her family, I'm not anything in particular, but that's just amazing. And then I think the third one, I'll throw in two parts for the third one. I have to mention my wife, because my wife has been a life, she's without my wife I wouldn't be alive today, basically, and that has to do a lot with the mental health problems and struggles that I've had over the years as well. So she's put up with a lot. She's cared for me in ways that are unimaginable when I've been at my lowest. And a second part of that I think back to is I was at a conference probably about 3 or 4, maybe 5 years ago in New Zealand, and I tried to commit suicide. And it before I'd had those kind of ideas and thoughts based, there was a lot of trauma from my childhood and abuse and stuff like that too, and things that I should have learned to deal with, or not deal with, but find ways to be able to manage them and to be able to live. And I always just kind of buried it, or I drugs, alcohol, gambling, just keep myself busy, and find a way to get through it. And it kind of all just caught up with me. And so there had been times where I'd harmed myself before, but I think they were probably more about attention or making it known. But this time I just stepped in front of a truck on a highway, and it was someone behind me that grabbed me and pulled me back onto the road. And though that experience, and I remember, I think I was awake for about 3 days straight after that, because it was this struggle. We didn't have much money or any money at all because of my own problems with gambling and being wasteful and everything of it too. So kind of talking to my wife, being able to get back from New Zealand back to Brisbane, to organising all these flights. And that's a moment when I got back, and I had been in a process of kind of seeking help to that point. But that's, I think, the moment where I really realized that I did want to live, and I did want to find a way to be able to live in a way that was, not necessarily that I'm ever going to cure all of my ailments or my thoughts or the pain or anything like that, but be able to find a way to be okay and to be able to live and, to find something through that. So my wife, there's lots of amazing, fantastic times with my wife as well. So it's not like it's just been this
one of many.
But it's just that moment in particular that was a pivotal kind of wake up. And again, I think the grace of someone else, of others, and our responsibility to others and to community is so much part of my belief, not just my beliefs, but my research and what I look at with regards to the law and how we go about doing things, and it informs my research on Indigenous peoples and law and stuff like that too. So it was just such a I think not a challenge, but an affirmation of things that I knew were important that I'd kind of lost touch with, or that were able to kind of bring me back to somewhere where I was able to see a way forward.
You mentioned these stories of people affecting you in word form or in action form. Like, for example, you mentioned a family member that told you, you can actually go to college, you can actually go to university. And, that might seem perhaps like a given to some people,
Yeah,
but for some people it might not be a given. I hear some people close to me, some friends, or even my dad, who was the first one who actually was able to obtain a university degree out of his whole family of, you know, big family. So I think it's seven siblings, and so this idea of beating the odds,
yeah,
or you know, counter counter contradicting the discourse, contradicting the predetermined or prescripted narrative that is already spoken over your life. So then to have someone step in and I like to use the word problematize, like
yeah,
whether intentionally or whether accidentally, but nonetheless you problematize this sort of like foregone conclusion, like
yeah,
or they'll say your last name, or like the like they said of the historical Jesus, nothing good can come out of Galilee, or nothing good can
yeah,
come out of, so there's pre-stigmas that sometimes fall over us, and to have someone that says, fuck that, I want to speak life into you, and I think that's I guess you're a testament to that.
yeah. It was. I mean, I think it's why it sticks. So clearly. He passed in his mid-50s. My uncle, um, and I didn't really have a close relationship with him at all. But it was just that memory of that, and so many other people, told me that you're going to be just like your family. You're not going to, you're not going to amount to anything. You're going to do this. You'll go to jail like them. You'll, and there's so much of that and to deal with. But there's just that. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's something. People like to argue about people being inherently, predisposed a particular way,
Mm-hmm.
nurture over nature or whatever. And I mean, I just don't see it because I've come from the same place that a lot of my family, my cousins and stuff come from, and I think about these key points. Even some of the things with my cousins, like I used to get up, you know, some pretty terrible, terrible things with them as well, and they were a little bit older than me, and they looked out for me too. So, the idea that everyone or people just inherently this way, but had it not been for a couple of people that intervened, or a couple of things that happened in a particular way with me, I can't say that I wouldn't have been in the same position, that they ended up, whether it be in prison or with drug and alcohol abuse and stuff like that too. So it's just it's something, and I think it's something I decided when I finished my law degree, which I did as my second degree. I had an opportunity to go work elsewhere and to do something I'd wanted to do for a long time, but I decided not to do that, and I ended up going back to university to work in Indigenous student support. So I had an opportunity to come up there, and I just felt it was something, it's a bit of a cliche kind of thing, but to be able to give back, to be able to do it, and it's not like it
Yeah.
was charity. I got paid very, very well to be Indigenous student support officer, but that idea that I was able to pay it forward, or to do something, or to provide that help and that guidance that I'd taken so much benefit from, and like you said, so many Indigenous people, and I myself was the first in my family to go to university. So many of our people here in Australia are the first in their families to go to university. Historically, when I think about my nan and her generation, and but even my aunties and my mum and stuff, there was an expectation that they would be domestic servants. They would serve other people. They would work in people's houses. The men were only destined for manual labor because that was believed to be the limit of what Aboriginal people could do. The kind of social Darwinism, racism stuff that informed national policies and state and territory policies right up until in Queensland, right up until the 1970s. We had something called the Aborigines Protection Act, which enabled basically complete control over Aboriginal people's lives if you were under the act. So it's not only there's that generational expectation and the impact of those kind of things on people too. It's just those little interventions and doing what we can in those moments has been something that stuck with me so much.
Eddie, for people on this side of the world that know that there are clear cuts and divides, and racially speaking, in all the countries in the world. What is though the story, or the stories, or the particularity of the black people, or of black or Aboriginal people in Australia? What is we have in the United States, African Americans, and I know there's a connectingness, no, but there are particularities. There are the different the differences in the stories. So when we're talking about the Aboriginal people in Australia, so who are we talking about? What is the history there? What isn't perhaps written in the history books that are probably mainline published.
Yeah.
What is that story, and where are we now? Where are we now? I see this flag you have back there. What are those what are those symbols there as well? I know there's the colonialistic legacy still very alive and well in Australia. So just give us a bit of a rundown of what has been the Aboriginal experience in Australia.
So I guess as a starting point, according to our traditions and beliefs, and that's so when I say our, at colonialism, the estimate is there was over 400 different distinct groups of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. So a lot of those groups were, or could be, kind of grouped more closely together, and their languages were kind of similar and were related to one another and kind of regionally across Australia. But according to our traditions, we've been here in this country, or as part of this country, or the country is part of us since time immemorial. So all of our creation stories, all of our traditions and cultures come from being created with the land and processes from there. According to science, we've been here for at least 60,000 years. So our history and our connection to this country is so intimately woven with who we are as a people. So our languages, are based in those, the word for the river will change based on the seasonal flow and the level of the water and stuff like that too. So everything is so much connected in relation in that aspect. So the British came here in 1770. Captain Cook, which other people would be familiar with Hawaii, and he was out here to map the transit of Venus. So it's so much related to the idea of science and progress and racism in part of this kind of history too. And he had secret instructions to discover the Great Southern Land. The Dutch had been here about 150 years before the British. And the Chinese had been traveling here for about 3,000 years before that as well. The difference there being they were trading and interacting with Indigenous peoples in the north of the country. Mm-hmm. And then in the north of the country, Aboriginal people have had relations with the Macassans and the Indonesians, which is, it's only at our doorstep, really. And then our Torres Strait Islander peoples have a lot of relationships with that area as well. And so I think I think it's Badu Island in the Torres Strait. On a clear day, you can see Papua New Guinea, so it's not that far away from those kind of areas. And then I guess as part of British colonialism, 1788, the first fleet came out. The British came out with convicts and convict transportation. So a lot of that was related to where they were going to transport convicts after the War of Independence in the US and what was happening there. And there were a couple of different options. They came here. Despite the numerous kind of instructions to enter into agreements or to, make treaties with Indigenous peoples here in Australia, we've never had it. So we're a bit of an outlier in that respect when compared to other British Empire possessions or colonies or invasions. We've never had a formal agreement. We've never had formal recognition that it's our territory, it's our land, or that we have particular rights. So in the US, in Canada, North America, New Zealand are the most commonly compared ones. There was at least some recognition, and it has at least given some rights. Obviously, it hasn't been a great time for those people either, and those rights have been encroached and taken away, and have been used, and in treaties historically actually used to control and decimate and oppress people more so than actually grant and recognize their rights. And I guess all of that kind of experience. So we're colonized later in the kind of empire than what a lot of other places were too. So 1788. So all those experiences they've brought here, and then since that time, Aboriginal Australians have consistently been placed at the bottom of the racial hierarchies that different various peoples have placed. So, and that very much impacted the colonial attitudes, policy attitudes. And then so too did the kind of geographical expanse of colonialism. So the east coast of Australia kind of bore the brunt of colonialism, especially down south. So New South Wales, Victoria, Sydney and Melbourne. And then colonialism kind of expanded outwards to Western Australia into the Northern Territory. So the Northern Territory has the highest percentage Indigenous population. It's about 50% Indigenous, whereas we're only 3% of the population now nationally.
Wow.
And then over that time, originally there were people that were just outrightly racist and would attack Indigenous peoples, but most of it came about in conflict over land and territory. So Indigenous peoples' lands that we would use to live off, and that was part of who we are, being taken for agriculture, for sheep, for cattle, and expansively going out. And we had a lot of frontier conflict. So there's a popular myth in Australia that Australia is a democracy born free of violence. There wasn't a revolution, there wasn't anything else. It was the colonies coming together and agreeing to be in a federation. And that erases the 100 or so years of violence against Indigenous peoples on the frontier, where people were poisoned, where people were shot, people were butchered. So all those kind of things were going on. And that was experienced differently too. So when my family in New South Wales and Victoria were being put onto missions or reserves, so missions were run by church organisations and reserves were run by the state, by the governments themselves. So you were taken from your traditional territory, you were put into these places, you were given rations. If you had employment, the protector or the person that ran the mission or reserve would take your money from you. So it was a racist, it's part of segregating Aboriginal people from society. So whilst that was happening to my family in New South Wales, in Queensland and Northern Territory, people were still being murdered on the frontier as colonialism was expanding. So there's that kind of different spread of the experience of colonialism across Australia as well. And then, those attitudes become formalized into the policies, so the Protection Acts that I was talking about. We had acts in Australia called the Half-Caste Acts, which the idea was that full-blood Aboriginal people would die out eventually, and half-caste would be assimilated and bred into the white population. And so in Australia, notoriously, one of our first acts of parliament, not the first one, but one of the first ones in our first year was the White Australia policy. So it was aimed at immigration, not so much, it wasn't aimed at Aboriginal people, but the idea was Aboriginal people were dying out, so we wouldn't have to worry about that black problem within Australia. The main problem we had to worry about was restricting coloured immigration into Australia. So this is, this is the language of the time. I've been doing a bit of research on this lately because I'm writing a paper about national identity in the Australian Constitution and how it came about. And so those policies and that history and it deeply informed who we are and how we see ourselves as a country. It informed how cities and towns have been developed. So the white areas, which people in the US would be very familiar with as well, with the infrastructure and development as opposed to the black areas. So there are still towns you can go to in Australia that you can tell by the roads and the public services and the kind of things that they have that it's an Aboriginal area. It's where immigrants and refugees live and stuff like that too. And so this has been deeply, and then we kind of followed behind other places in the change in racial attitudes. So I remember some things under the Lyndon Johnson presidency, there was an American warship here, and the authorities in Brisbane were refusing the African Americans to be able to board, come ashore and have their leave. And I think Lyndon Johnson basically told them, this was in the times when the White Australia policy was still in place in Australia as well. So it caused, international concerns. We trailed behind America in the civil rights movements and stuff like that. And then Aboriginal people here in Australia took it upon themselves. So we had our own kind of freedom rides and movements like that traveled throughout some of the worst communities in rural Australia to highlight the racism and what was happening. And so that's kind of been the history of, where it's gone to. And today what we're dealing with is still just this legacy of racism. So racism is still very much alive and well and living and thriving in Australia. It's been emboldened, over the last 4 years by a particular president. And the politics and the way that's played out, but it's been a big issue here for a long time before that too. So we had a kind of in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, riding off that civil rights movement, we had changes that focused on self-determination for Indigenous peoples. So changes that were happening at international levels were being implemented here too through Indigenous advocacy. And then we had a really kind of seismic shift in our national politics in the 90s when a conservative government was elected, Prime Minister John Howard. People may be familiar with him. He was one of George Bush's key supporters for the war on terror. And John Howard was actually in America when September 11 happened. And he was one of the first, I think he may have been the first Western leader to commit to the coalition, to be able to, so basically he gave George Bush a clean slate at that time. If you want to go to war, whatever you want to do, Australia's with you all the way kind of thing. But John Howard's politics, the changes his government and his kind of politics implemented in the 1990s we're still dealing with today. So they saw a reduction in funding for programs about self-determination and empowering Indigenous communities. And so they mainstreamed a lot of the services. And it was all about being one Australia, not different peoples. So not about respectful recognition and difference for Indigenous peoples, but about one Australia. So he took previously treaty negotiations were on the table. He said a country doesn't sign a treaty with itself. So he took treaty negotiations off the table. He refused to apologise for something that we had called stolen generations, which is when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were taken from their families and put into hostels and homes and with other families.
To civilize, right?
Yeah. And we've very much been dealing. So we got this body out of that called the Council for Australian Reconciliation and Reconciliation Australia. And they've done the best that they can do in the last kind of 2 or 3 decades with what they've provided. But it's a very weak, performative reconciliation. It doesn't address any of the structural issues, any of the power issues, and the kind of things I'm talking about there. So the stat that's often thrown around is we're only 3% of the population, but 30% of the prison population. So things like that. The West, I don't know if it's correct at the moment, but it was the last time I was looking at it. The fastest growing prison population in Australia is Aboriginal women in Western Australia. We've had I guess, as a lot of other places have had numerous royal commissions, national level inquiries into the impact of racism. So one of them was the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. And this is something that's come up massively this year with the Black Lives Matter protests and what happened after, the murder of George Floyd too. So, we've had our own George Floyds here in Australia, and it really brought that home. And we had this inquiry and these recommendations that were made in 1993, I believe, about Aboriginal deaths in custody. It highlighted that racism was an issue and this legacy of colonial Australia and the way that Indigenous people were treated. And since that time, we've had over 440 Indigenous people die in custody. No one's ever been prosecuted. Coroner's report after coroner's report makes recommendations about holding people responsible and what they can do. And horrific circumstances. So one gentleman was cooked to death in the back of a prison van when they were driving long distances out in the Australian desert areas. Yeah. Choked. Similar things to George Floyd, choked to death. Aboriginal people picked up for public drunkenness and then, suspiciously hitting their head or something like that in the prison cell and dying. So a lot of the similar kind of issues that people will be familiar with about criminalization and stuff like that too. But then this legacy of racism that it has on our social services, on the support that we have for communities. So the treaty negotiations are kind of building again and back on the table. And one of the things that I'm involved in constitutional reform is about providing us a permanent institution in the Constitution that gives us recognition of who we are as Aboriginal people and our rights, so that we can actually begin that process to negotiate treaties and look at truth-telling and do other things. But a lot of the things that the state governments and a lot of the other areas that they're offering as part of treaty negotiations are things like education, clean water, roads, like things that people should just be entitled to because you're a citizen or you're a member of a community. Not, when we're talking treaty, Aboriginal people are talking reparations, we're talking land, we're talking
Talk about missing the point.
Yeah, so it's we're still, very much dealing with this neoliberal pushback and this kind of space about where Aboriginal people fit in Australia, because Australia doesn't have a comfortable story about where we fit. They either excluded us, and it's interesting to read the historical record from not that long ago, because they openly admitted, that they stole the land because the Aborigines weren't doing anything with it and they weren't going to do anything with it, and it's our right to do it. And now they, now they won't recognise that, but they'll also say, well, we're all one Australians. If you want land, you go and buy it, or if you want,
so that's a way to invisibilize. It's kind of like the melting pot myth. Melting pot. There's no diversity. We're all coming together but in that coming together, you're renouncing to what makes you an individual. So then, but at the same time, it's like the white individual remains an individual. So everyone else has to kind of like assimilate.
Yeah. So the standard of the individual is, of course, the objective white, and then culture is apparently just a choice that you make as an individual to go along with. And so that is for me, as a researcher, as a lawyer, that's our foundational narrative and story that we still haven't addressed, and that still impacts us every day in practical ways. But then racism, of course, expands beyond that. The Chinese community has been in Australia for a very long time, and has, bore the brunt of that too. And most recently with our immigration detention policies and our attitudes towards refugees. So we outsource our immigration detention now. So we pay poor countries in our neighborhood to basically run prisons for us, where we detain our refugees, and people are, dying in those institutions as well. And President Trump even praised our immigration policies and the restrictions that we have, which, is quite galling too. And
I guess makes sense, no?
Yeah, but it's something I often tell to my students, if you're horrified at the fact that we're putting people in these camps and we're detaining them and we're doing these things to them, and it's not because, refugees are immigrants, it's because they're colored people. It's because, these are the reasons why. There's this inherent kind of thing. But we've been doing it since the beginning of Australia. You know, they did it to my ancestors. They did it to my family. You know, my nan lived. You know, it was her generation that lived in these camps in these places, and in very many ways, we're still segregated in our communities based on the legacy of that history. So there's a really good example of this that I always think about with housing. There was this debate in the 1950s in this town, Deniliquin, where my family are from, and it was about, I think the newspaper clipping was the Blacks camp and what they were going to do with the camp. So there was this camp that had been set up just outside of community. So my family and a couple others had been kicked off the mission. They introduced these half-caste acts at the time that said unless you were a full-blood Aboriginal person, you couldn't stay. You know, the provisions and the services weren't for you. You had to go off and assimilate into community. But community also didn't accept you as, you know, as a fully fledged white citizen either. So you're still black. You're just not black enough to be part of this, and you can't fit in community. And so, you know, poor, the low social, all that kind of stuff. So they set up these fringe camps all around, you know, towns all around Australia, because our labour was relied on. You know, our cheap labour was relied on, and people were still being used in this way as well. And then as those attitudes started to change, it's like, well, what are we going to do with this camp? It's an eyesore. We need to remove it. And so they developed and they started getting funding for Aboriginal public housing. But all they've really done is they've moved the camp from the riverside to the north of the town and basically based all of the Aboriginal people in that part. And when you drive through town, you can tell by the way that, you know, the public services are different. The parks are all dilapidated. There's no service. There's no infrastructure. So they've just ghettoized this entire area. And of course, it's us as Aboriginal people that get the blame for this. Why can't you uplift yourself? Why can't you take up the opportunities? Why can't you do, you know, all these other kind of things? And the really interesting thing I find in a lot of these small towns across Australia is it's the same families that still own the farms and the big properties that took the land originally and that my ancestors worked for. So I remember sitting down having it was like coffee and cake with my nan or something in one of these towns, and this old white couple come up to us and mistook my nan for her sister, but both of them used to work as domestics for that woman's family on the property, and they did the cooking and the cleaning and everything else. And it was our land traditionally as Aboriginal people, and they ended up working for free for this family, and now it's still these, you know, and so they're second, third, fourth generation people now. Property is inherited, wealth is inherited, all these kind of things are passed on. Yet, you know, the blame for the failure to uplift ourselves still lays at our feet. And so all of those kind of things, I guess, you know, hopefully that provides a bit of a, you know, I should say we have come some way. There have been, you know,
I was just about to ask
things.
you. I was just about to ask you what. However, and not to make some sort of silver lining out of this. So, what is the silver lining of oppression and slavery? What has been problematized enough or problematized sufficiently that there have been some form of advances, maybe, you know, legislatively speaking, in Australia in the last decade or so you can point to?
So I think that the flag behind me is probably a really good example.
What's the story there?
So Harold Thomas was the creator of this flag, and there's a bit of controversy about the flag at the moment in Australia. I'll explain that later on. But
about this controversy about this flag?
Yeah, about this flag, because Harold Thomas technically owns the copyright for the flag and has licensed that copyright, and now it's become this issue about should he have done that, and
defeats
Aboriginal
the purpose. Is kind of weird.
Yeah, but there's a lot of like community politics behind it too, and so but the flag came out of the 70s, out of the protest years, so it was, you know, our people had been held back for so long, but there's this one thing people talk about, you know, we stand on the shoulders of giants, that people have come before us that have, you know, done the hard yards. And so from those early days, especially in the, so even going back to the frontier wars, you know, our people didn't just die down and accept it like the early Australian history books especially said. We fought back. we fought hard, and they came for us because we fought hard and did the old things where they'd take people's heads and take it back to collections in the UK and stuff like that too. So, bone collecting and stuff like that as well. So that's all part of that. Especially in the 20s and in the 30s, it was a real focus on law reform and legislative reform. And there was a key group of people that had grown up on these missions and reserves. And because of those key kind of interventions or moments in their life, so there was a gentleman called Thomas Shadrach James, who I believe was from Sri Lanka, and he ended up at Kamargunja, this community where some of my family are from, and he was Oxford educated. He taught the children, he taught the adults, and so these adults are getting, and these kids are getting an education that was probably better than most, poor working class white people at the time as well. And so the ability to be able to speak back to the colonizer or to the government in their own language, to point out their hypocrisy, to point out that we have our rights, we have all these kind of things. And William Cooper, who is this Aboriginal activist, if you Google him, he has the most amazing moustache. It's fantastic. He led the only protest in the world against the I think it's the Crystal Night, the night of the against the Germans. So he led this silent protest against the German embassy in the 1930s. So here we have this Aboriginal man whose people are oppressed in his own country, and he's leading this protest against this foreign government in this country, and it's saying we understand and we express this solidarity with with these people that are being oppressed in this way. And so from that very early time, they formed organizations. They got involved with the union movement and the labor movement. So the union movement was originally very racist because they didn't want cheap Aboriginal labor or black labor. So they were some of the key kind of pushers of the White Australia policy, but then they were also the first ones to turn around and start advocating for Aboriginal rights as well. And so since that time, really, the union movement and the labor movement has been a very big part of kind of solidarity for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights. So we started organizing, protesting, getting petitions up, asking, for federal representation in Parliament, for recognition of our rights as Indigenous peoples, and these things that we're still arguing for, 100 years later as well. And so based on that history, then going into the 60s and the 70s, but it was in the 60s and the 70s that Aboriginal people, similar to kind of the story of the Black Panthers as well, people don't get, a lot of the stuff the Black Panthers did was breakfast clubs and school stuff, and it wasn't this, they're going to overthrow the government. There's the militarized kind of stuff, but people don't understand it was about community organization for themselves, because no one else is doing it for them, right? And so it was our people, our community to organize. They started legal centers, they started medical centers, they started these organizations and their clubs for themselves. And then from that sense of empowerment and the resources it provided, and of course allies along the way that were able to help out too, we're able to start to get a foothold in some of these things and start to demand legislative change. We had big political change in the 70s here with the election of Gough Whitlam as well, which was, I think, after about 25 years of conservative government following World War II. And he instigated this group called the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee at the federal level. And before that, we had this weird kind of thing where the federal government didn't have the power to legislate for Aboriginal people because the Constitution prohibited them from doing so. So it was only left up to the states and territories. So we had a referendum in 1967, and that was a big part of this movement too. It was about giving the federal government the power to be able to legislate and do something beneficial, although that power has been used negatively against Aboriginal people as well. But it was really out of that, the power and the struggle of our own people and the community organization looking for community, and then that getting into those spaces and into those structures of power and be able to demand change. So since then, we've had some key legal challenges and wins in the courtrooms. Mabo probably being one of the biggest ones, which recognised our native title rights, so our rights to property. So we have common law property system without giving a big lecture about native title and where it comes from.
So previous this, there wasn't any right to...
No. So pre this, they said, there's no Aboriginal land rights, there's no nothing. Whereas in other places, so US, the treaties were recognised and Indigenous rights were recognised. Americans. Yeah. Oh. So we didn't have any of that. but then it's created its own problems as well. So you have to be able to prove connection to the land. So where colonialism has had a massive impact on Indigenous peoples, and we can't prove that
It's
connection.
hard, yeah. It's
Yeah.
nearly impossible.
But so out of that, so a lot of the developments we've had coming from the Indigenous community themselves, but then leveraging a lot of those international changes that were happening. So the elimination of all forms of racial discriminations. We had a domestic act that was implemented to implement that, and Aboriginal people have been able to use that to argue that if you extinguish native title, or if you're destroying a piece of land, then you're treating our rights inherently racist, as opposed you're being in that kind of process. And so those kind of equal protection legislation, all those kind of things that come along, and then like I said, we got to the 90s and it kind of stalled on those kind of things. So in most places now, they fly the Aboriginal flag, they recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We have programs that help us with funding for language protection and redevelopment for communities, all these other kind of things. But there's still that kind of ceiling that we're kind of waiting to break through, or trying to break through, which is that fundamental recognition of our right as Indigenous peoples that we just don't have. So in other places, like I said, it's still, they've still had their issues, but Canada's a good one as an example. They've got Section 35 in their constitution where, they have to be negotiated with on their rights. We just don't have that hook or that recognition or that early treaty or whatever it is to force the government at the table to be able to do that. And that's, it impacts us in so many ways. It impacts us practically in not being able to do anything, but then symbolically too, like I was talking about, Australia doesn't know where to fit Aboriginal people. There's this uncomfortable history or story about the way they've treated us. They don't want to be truthful or honest about their own history. And then also coming to terms with that history and what that means. So, we can say sorry, but we're not going to talk about reparations, or we're not going to talk about very similar to some of the debates that happen in the US about reparations for slavery and stuff like that too.
And there was, if I fail not to remember, there was a couple of years ago. There were those. I remember because it made some sort of international news that there was some mainline national apology to the natives and the Aboriginals. This happened. I don't know if it was like less than 10 years ago or so, or around.
Yeah, so 2007. So John Howard, so John Howard, who was that Conservative Prime Minister that said that,
I remember because I lived in Australia from 05, 06, and I think he was minister then.
Yeah, so he always refused to say sorry. And he said, we're not responsible for what happened. And then they also excused it by saying, it was well intentioned. It was just based on the ideas of the time, which is rubbish as well. And
so worse.
Yeah. So Kevin Rudd, who became Prime Minister, he apologized, and I remember I cried. It was big. It was you finally get the Prime Minister formally recognizing and apologizing for these kind of things.
What do you think led to that? Led to that moment?
There'd been a lot of community, agitating for it. The Howard years had focused a lot of people's anger and activism as well. So the Stolen Generation report came out in the 90s, and those kind of reports have been instigated by the previous Labor government. John Howard come in. He dismissed a lot of the findings. He had those excuses that it was done with the best of intentions. There are still people today that deny the Stolen Generations ever happened, and all that kind of stuff. And it'd been building. There'd been a massive public. Like I said, I think the government's always kind of behind on the public on this. There'd been massive public support for the apology and for it to happen. And I guess 10 years on, or where we are now, 13 years on from it, it was an apology for one very specific part of our history. It wasn't for all of it. It was for Stolen Generations. And at the same time, whilst they apologise, they've instigated some very oppressive and racist policies at the same time too. So you can only take the apology as far as you can with that, when in practice on the ground we've had these.
So after that apology, there was what was using that as a reference point. Was there any very intentional and militant follow up to put even more pressure from activist communities, given that okay, well now there's some sort of conversation going. Um,
It
I
was
mean,
it was already there, and I think the apology came about as a large part of that pressure, and then it just I guess the disappointment after a couple of
that's
years
enough.
following the apology, yeah, and they because they instigated something called closing the gap. The government, sorry, instigated closing the gap after the national apology. So it's a report that the government gives or the prime minister gives every year now. And so when they talk about closing the gap, they're talking about life expectancy between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So, we're expected to
Uh,
die 10, 15 years young, all those other kind of things. And they talk about all of the good things they're doing to help close this gap. It's none of it's about, fundamentally
real, true.
recognizing or empowering us. Yeah. And so that has really spurned on and, really
It's
it's
adding insult to injury.
encouraged a whole nother and it's encouraged a whole nother generation of activists too to really hit home on those points about treaty and one thing I'm involved in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is voice, treaty, and truth. So the federal recognition of an institution in the constitution or voice, so we can have political representation, so we're not just silenced by the government. Treaties and then the truth telling process as well. And there's again with that, I think the majority of Australians are ready for that. It's just the political class that are once again holding that back or holding progress back on that too.
And I have a question on that. So when is Australia's next election process? And what does that look like in terms of the people that are running or expected to be
Mm.
running?
So probably mid 2022. So we had one midway through last year. Scott Morrison's our prime minister, conservative.
Yeah, more right winning. Yeah,
Yeah, a little bit Trumpy.
hmm
Um,
evangelical. The
yeah, well,
schools are.
he's a member of Hillsong,
Oh,
so
the good
he and
kind.
him, yeah, him and Brian Houston. Brian Houston's the founder of Hillsong. Him and Brian Houston are best mates. So there's a lot of controversy around that and what's going on. But there's been a lot of debate here about what a Biden presidency could mean for Australian politics because we lurched very far right, especially with regard to climate change and in response to the bushfires and stuff like that. We're now one of the very few governments, and Biden's announced his intention to sign up again to the Paris Climate Agreement and do various different parts of that process. So whether or not there will be pressure from that kind of front on our national politics and politicians, or whether or not we'll be able to weather that, but we've got our national our government at the moment, our party that's in control, key members of that are wanting to build new coal-fired power stations. um, and so climate change is a very big, it's one of the big debates that we just haven't been able to have well at all. I mean, I know, even Boris Johnson is doing stuff on climate change. Like, it's just ridiculous that, here in Australia. And it's a big issue for us as Indigenous people. So, some Torres Strait Islander communities recently filed some paperwork with the United Nations about breaching their human rights and the basis because, their islands are being washed away because of the
Yeah.
rising sea levels. So, there's that, and there's been a lot of corruption scandals. Nothing really sticks, which is probably a familiar thing for a lot of people. And Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, has a background in marketing and advertising. So he's the ads guy. He's able to he spins these one-liners and stuff like that, and he seems to be able to get away with a lot. But yeah, the biggest thing at the moment is, they're trying to make it all about what they've done in response to the pandemic and taking credit for all of that and saying, we can steer you through the economic
Mm.
recovery and the community recovery now. Um, I'm I'm a bit worried that they'll win again. Our opposition isn't. I mean, they're
Strong
fine.
enough.
Yeah, they're just a bit. Um, you know,
Like here,
bit,
like in the
yeah,
U.S., very centrist and not exciting. Um,
yeah. Yeah, and we like even with the centrist opposition, they took some policies to the last election that tried to take away some of the middle class welfare that we have in this country. That's just ridiculous. So
Wow.
tax cuts to high income learners and stuff like that, and they got pillared for it at the election. So Australians are very selfish when it comes to the hip pocket and thinking independently what's good for them, economically wise, which
Yeah.
isn't good for them in the long term or for the country.
And
Um,
demonizing the poor as well, or
yeah. So
mm,
we, if any, encourage anyone if you're interested to Google the Robo debt scheme. So they had this automated system that was matching people's incomes and entitlements around welfare system. They've just had to announce a $1.2 billion settlement for that scheme, which in Australian dollars is not insignificant for the size of our country and our people. People committed suicide. It's been a disastrous, social policy that was just aimed at demonising the poor and people on welfare. And even though they've had this loss and they've had to pay out this settlement, I think it's achieved what the government ideologically has wanted to do, which is just continue to demonise the poor
mm,
and people on
mm.
welfare, and they make it. It's not about supporting or growing community infrastructure. It's very punitive. Everything's got a punitive edge to it in the policy
Yeah.
process and how they go about doing that.
And I've been kind of like throwing up a cloud of smoke as a form of distracting, creating popular opinion, and the blame game, shifting it
Yeah,
away from pointing upwards, and then you're pointing downwards or
yeah.
horizontally to those alongside you.
So we've had Senate estimates, which is the committees where they review the departments and the policies and what they spend money on and everything. And yeah, you've got these heads of these departments that run these programs going to this infinite degree of complexity to deny responsibility for the suicide of, I think it was the latest count was nearly 3,000 people committed suicide, as what the community
Wow.
groups are saying as a direct response. So people were getting bills from the government, from the tax office, from social services saying they owed the government, $20,000, $30,000 because they'd been overpaid when they didn't owe that money. It
Yeah.
was incorrect, and vulnerable people in vulnerable circumstances, and that's the last thing that they need that tipped them over the edge. And so the government, to watch these public servants try and dance around it and not accept responsibility and say, it's unfortunate that people are taking their lives, but it has nothing to do with, our policy and all other kind of stuff. So there's well and truly enough ammunition for an opposition government, I think, to really take this government down and to make
Mm-hmm.
some significant changes. It's just the opposition itself is fighting with itself at the moment. One of the key kind of secretaries of the cabinet members just quit because he wants more coal-fired powered stations as well. And yeah,
Wow.
just it's um,
Yeah, it's very
very
disheartening. Um,
yeah, and very similar tensions, like you said, with the centrist, largely centrist Democratic Party. And apart from the real kind of extremist differences that come up, there's not much difference policy wise on a lot of the other kind of issues that, we need significant investment in social housing in this country. We haven't had significant investment in, social housing for a very long time. And I guess us, like many other countries around the world, inequality and the gap between the rich and the poor is just growing. And where the poor themselves are being demonized for that. And we just had tax breaks, put through for middle income earners and high income earners. So it's I mean I think it's perverse and disgusting, but this is the kind of thing that they're preoccupied with. They're not preoccupied with helping people or building
yeah.
community infrastructure in these kind of places. Preoccupied with middle class welfare and enabling people to become more wealthy.
Hey, man. As we bring this conversation to a wrap, I like closing off in lines of the utopic realm, or the utopic realm of inspiration that helps us mobilize and strive forward, as a Uruguayan author Eduardo Galeano would say. That utopic reference in the horizon that makes us move forward, even though it seems you take 5 steps, it takes 5 steps forward, you take 10 steps, and it takes 10 steps forward. So then, what is the whole point of there just it hovering in the horizon? So then it is that reminder that it is not so much touching it, but it is that moving forward, that constant having something as a reference point to continue moving forward, and not necessarily rely on this sort of like trophy grabbing, process sabotaging narrative that dismisses the value of the journey of the process. So what for you is it, and intertwined with the Aboriginal community and the Aboriginal issues at hand in Australia? What are some things that allow you to have a sense of utopia in the horizon, to look forward? And I don't know if there's a little bit of that symbol in that flag, because I believe that
Yeah.
flag has like the horizon, like the sunset, no, or the
Yeah.
sunrise.
So the sun, the people, and the land. Um, and I think it is, I mean, it's what the flag represents. It's what I said about family being number one. And you'll hear a lot of Indigenous people say this. Yeah, my sense of hope for the future is our past. Like I said, we believe we've been here since time immemorial. Science tells us we've been here for 60,000 years. And whilst it's been destructive and we need change immediately and our people are dying and we need all these things, colonialism has been a 230-year blip in comparison to the 4,000 thousand years of generations that of our people on this land, and not the mythical kind of thing that a lot of people like to say about just surviving, or we've adapted and we've changed, and just because it's something I try to explain to my students, just because a cultural artifact it doesn't look the same it did 250 years ago, doesn't mean we're not Aboriginal today as people and our traditions and cultures moving forward. And there are so many days when I could quit. I could give up, and I think a lot of people get that feeling. But then I've got a photo of my family at my uncle's funeral, actually, that I was talking about, under a big tree. Hold on, I'll just grab it so I can show it. Probably better. So this one here, that's my big head on the side there.
Yeah.
But that tree. So when I was talking about the fringe camp that our family used to live in, that tree is at that fringe camp, and that's where they used to live underneath there. So they had a little corrugated iron shack built with mud floors. So it's called the Flats, or it's commonly referred to as the Flats, and that's where my family lived. 100 years ago, 100 to 80 years ago, they lived there because they were outcasts from society. But not only did they survive, they thrived. They, I feel, connected to them in so many ways, like what they went through, what they struggled with, what we've been able to change, and where we've come from. And a lot of the issues that we face do seem insurmountable, and and we have a big issue with youth suicide with our people, which is familiar to a lot of people in similar kind of situations. But I often look at that photo and I think the strength of who we are and where we've come from, our traditions, our cultures, our experiences, and what we've survived before as well. And I think we are amazingly adaptive and flexible people. Obviously, that doesn't excuse.
It doesn't justify, of course, yeah.
No, all of the things that we have to adapt and be flexible for. But I think it does give us strength in not only surviving.
And to close off too, I understand you have a little one as well, as I've seen in your recent posts, and that's been I mean, that it definitely brightens my day to see some of these pictures, and I love it. I don't know if you just to close off, and to kind of close off in that realm of the striving for the future. How has it been this sort of like new chapter in your life? I mean, other than the sleepless nights or the sleepless mornings or the
Yeah.
sleepless part of the day, you
Well, I
know?
guess yeah, going back to dealing with COVID as well. He arrived. So we had the miscarriage last year, which was quite traumatic, and my wife required. She had to have two surgeries following that.
Wow.
And then Arthur, who's our little one, he came 7 weeks early. So
Yeah.
nothing's been easy this year. But in saying that, I have to say I'm often very critical of the Australian government and of my own country. But we are very lucky with the healthcare system that we have here in Australia. We have free universal healthcare. So he got the best. And we have one of the best
Super.
health systems in the world. So he was well looked after. He was in intensive care. Then a special care unit after that, and he's back with us now. And he's actually named after my great grandfather, Arthur. So there's a great photo that I have under that same tree that I showed you before with Arthur Mullins, who was my great grandfather, and his family under that tree. And it was like I was saying, just feeling connected. And when I think about the things I've been through, and when he arrived, so suicide and the mental health and what my family's been through and everything else, it just everything made sense. I think I held him for a small moment just after he was born, and he fit kind of right into both my hands. He was that tiny, but um, everything just made sense and aligned, and I was so happy, and I am so happy that I'm alive now to be able to experience that and to be able to teach him and to grow with him and for him to teach me. And I'm hoping to get down to that tree actually in the new year, depending on what the border closures and everything are
Yeah.
like, so he can meet my family and I can take him to where our family have been for all those years, and to share all that with him. I don't know. It's amazing. I was always worried about being a father and being a parent because um,
Because of all
there's
these
so much.
reasons.
Yeah, there's so much going on. My own issues, my own childhood, my own
Yeah.
upbringing, the world, COVID, climate change, and everything. But
Plenty.
it's an affirming. All of it makes sense. This is why, like I said, family being one of the number one reasons before. It all makes sense, and looking at him, it all makes sense too, even if he isn't sleeping and doing everything else. But he's been the last couple of days actually. He slept. I think it was 2 nights ago for 5.5 hours for the
Oh, that's
first time.
wonderful.
So he's
That's
going well. But
wonderful.
I'm sure you'll see even more photos because that's
Yeah,
pretty much
no,
all I
I
post
hope
about
so.
now.
I hope so. Even though at a distance, and even though I haven't formally met any of you guys, I feel like I'm having a little bit of a graceful peeking into this wonderful moment. All the transitions, when he was still in the
Yeah,
hospital, I was kind of like following every time I would see a picture, and that that evolutionary process until you guys were able to bring him home. I think that was phenomenal. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that too from afar. So that's
yeah.
great.
No, that's um I was a bit like, how much do you share about your innocent child online? But
Hmm.
at the same time, I just so happy. I just want to share it with everyone. And that it was an experience itself being in hospital during COVID. With the procedures and everything. And
Jeez, yeah, I know what a
it's
time.
yeah, my a funny story that a lot of Indigenous people would be able to kind of relate to. My auntie was trying to get into the hospital to see him, and it was strict lockdown, so only my wife and I could go into the intensive care unit. And they have Aboriginal liaison officers, cultural liaison officers in all of the hospitals. And my cousin, who's from Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, she had both her children at this hospital in Brisbane. So my auntie had a pretty good relationship with them. So she dragged me basically kicking and screaming to the cultural liaison officer and was trying to get the cultural liaison officer to like
To
bash down the
grant.
door to intensive care so she could get access. And she said no to her, and she said, I'm very sorry, but it's because of COVID. We just can't.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
my auntie tried every cultural element she could think of to try and to try and get through. And then the liaison officer came and saw us when we were in the ward, and she had a good talk to me about managing family expectations. Because aside from the sleep and everything else, my auntie might be watching. Actually, I didn't even think about that. She's liked it every time I share it.
We'll give her the greets then.
Yeah, but no, it's great, and it's been, to be able to share him with them and to have family.
No, I can imagine that sense of urgency,
blessed.
of course. And I mean, you gotta play those cards at some times. You gotta definitely give it a go. There are some times where you gotta
Yeah.
you gotta push, of course, claro. But yeah, COVID times is definitely it's changed the ball game for everyone. Eddie, thanks so much, man. I really have enjoyed this chat from a long distance, but it definitely did not feel so long. It felt like we're just here having
No, it was good.
a cuppa and having a good chat. So much appreciated, my friend.
No, thank you again for the opportunity. It's fantastic to connect, to talk. One of my greatest experiences in doing these kind of things is being able to connect with people, and
Claro.
you learn that we're not so distant really with everything that's going on and stuff like that too. So
No,
thank you.
I completely agree with that. And so thank you until next time, man. If I'm ever down under, which has been a long time, I don't see it happening anytime soon, but if it doesn't, I mean, this medium is just it's wonderful to make the oceans feel a little bit less distant. So gracias, and also the people watching and everyone who's also maybe tuning in afterwards and watching this record. I hope you can enjoy this a little bit of Australian history and getting some perspective of our brothers and sisters in the different places in the world. So I like to close off with the words of a Puerto Rican astrologer or astrologist. I don't even know how to properly say it. But there's this documentary on Netflix on his life. He was quite a notable, legendary figure. And his name was Walter Mercado, and the documentary is it's on Netflix. It's Netflix produced, so it's available everywhere that has Netflix. It's called Mucho Amor, much love. And he always used to close his segments like this. And I remember when I was a little kid, I was watching my grandma's living room, and he would always close this segment by saying this: "Les deseo que tenga mucha paz." So I wish you have a lot of peace. Pero sobre todo que tenga mucho amor. So a lot of love. So in times like these, we definitely could use a lot of that to go around. So be in peace, everyone. Don't disconnect just yet, Eddie, and we'll see each other next time, people. Stay safe. Ciao.